The world had shrunk to the tunnel of light carved by our headlights through an absolute, consuming darkness. It was late, the kind of late that feels more like a different day than an extension of the previous one. The clock on the dashboard glowed a soft, green 2:17 a.m. I was slumped in the passenger seat of my dad's old sedan, lulled into a hazy, semi-conscious state by the monotonous hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the tires passing over seams in the asphalt. We were returning from a weekend visit to my grandparents, a 3-hour drive that had stretched into 4 with traffic and a late start. The familiar, comfortable sense of the car old leather, my dad's coffee thermos, the faint, sweet hint of the air freshener shaped like a pine tree dangling from the mirror, were the smells of my childhood, of 1,000 mundane journeys. They were smells that meant safety, meant home. Outside, the world was a different story. We had long since left the comforting glow of interstate lights and busy truck stops. Now we were navigating a secondary state highway, a ribbon of cracked pavement that wound its way through dense, sleeping farmland and patches of thick, untamed forest. There were no street lights out here. The only illumination came from our own headlights and the vast, indifferent spray of stars visible through the moon roof, a brilliant tapestry that felt both beautiful and terribly remote. There were no other cars. For miles at a time, ours was the only moving thing in this pocket of the universe. Occasionally, the lights of a lone farmhouse would blink like a distant ship on a dark sea before being swallowed again by the blackness. The silence in the car was a comfortable one, punctuated only by the low murmur of a classic rock station playing on the AM radio, the signal fading in and out with bursts of static, a ghostly voice from a faraway city. My father was a silhouette against the driver's window, his profile familiar and steady. One hand rested lightly on the wheel at the 6 o'clock position, the way he always drove on long trips. He'd been quiet for the last hour, but it was his normal, contemplative quiet. The quiet of a man comfortable with his own thoughts, lulled by the road. I remember studying the way the dashboard lights softened the lines on his face, making him look both older and timeless. He was my dad, the man who fixed broken bikes, who knew how to check the oil, whose presence was a constant, unwavering guarantee that everything was, and would be, okay. I was drifting, my head leaning against the cool glass of the window, my eyes half closed, watching the solid yellow line in the middle of the road endlessly unfurl and vanish under our wheels. It was hypnotic. The fatigue was a heavy blanket, pulling me down into a dreamless, peaceful place. The car was a warm, metal cocoon, a tiny vessel of light and life sailing through a sea of silent, sleeping nothingness. The concept of danger was an abstract one, something that happened in news reports and city streets, not out here on this empty road, not with my dad at the wheel. This was the deepest, most unshakable illusion of all. The belief that we were separate, insulated, protected from the darker currents of the world by the simple, steadfast act of moving forward together through the night. It was a peace that was about to be shattered, a silence that was about to be torn apart by a whisper that would change everything. The transition was not gradual. It was a seismic shift in the atmosphere of the car. So sudden and absolute it was as if the oxygen had been replaced with something thinner, colder. One moment, my father was the picture of relaxed vigilance, a man lost in the rhythm of the road. The next, he was a predator suddenly aware of a threat in the tall grass. It began with his hands. The casual, 6 o'clock grip on the steering wheel vanished. His knuckles whitened as he clenched the wheel at 10 and 2, his posture snapping ramrod straight. The subtle slouch of a long drive was gone, replaced by a taut, coiled tension that made the leather of his seat creak in protest. My own drowsy stupor evaporated, burned away by the sheer intensity of his transformation. I pushed myself upright, the cozy lassitude replaced by a prickling unease. "Dad? What is it?" He didn't answer. His head didn't turn an inch toward me. His entire being was focused through the windshield and, more intently, the rearview mirror. His eyes, which had been soft with fatigue, were now narrowed, constantly flicking between the road ahead and the reflection of the empty darkness behind us. He was no longer just driving. He was scanning, assessing, his every sense screaming on high alert. I followed his gaze to the rearview mirror. For a moment, I saw only our own twin headlights receding into the blackness. Then I saw it, or thought I did. A pair of pinpricks of light, far back but distinct. Another car. On this road, at this hour, its presence felt immediately, intrinsically wrong. It was too far back to be a coincidence, its speed seemingly matched to ours. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. The comfortable old sedan no longer felt like a cocoon. It felt like a glass box, exposed and vulnerable, hurtling through a landscape that had turned hostile. The classic rock station crackled with static, a distorted guitar solo wailing like an alarm. The familiar sense of leather and coffee now smelled like fear. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. When he finally spoke, his voice was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard. It was a low, measured, and deadly serious whisper, a sound that carried more urgency than any scream. It was a voice from a part of my father I never knew existed. Lock the doors. The command hung in the air, simple, clear, and chilling. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a protocol. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence. My hand, moving on pure, jittery adrenaline, shot out and fumbled for the power lock button on my door. The world had narrowed to that single, small circle of plastic. Time seemed to stretch each fraction of a second an eternity. My thumb found the button. I pressed it. The sound was absurdly loud in the tense silence of the car. A solid, definitive thunk as all four door locks engaged simultaneously. And in the heartbeat of silence that followed, a shape detached itself from the darkness beside my window. A pale, grasping hand shot out of the void, clamping onto the exterior door handle. The metal lever jerked downward with a violent, metallic crunch. The lock held. The door stayed shut. The world exploded into motion and sound. My father's foot slammed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared in protest, then obedience, and the car surged forward with a whiplash force that threw me back into my seat. The figure, a blur of pale flesh and dark clothing, vanished from the window, swallowed by the night and our sudden, frantic speed. We were alone again, screaming down the dark road. But the silence was gone. It was replaced by the roar of the engine, the sound of my own ragged, hyperventilating breaths, and the echoing, bone-deep terror of that single, failed attempt to get in. The illusion of safety was gone, shattered forever by a whisper and the violent lunge of a stranger from the dark. The roar of the engine was a primal scream in the night, a stark contrast to the whispered command that had preceded it. The force of the acceleration pinned me to the leather seat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. In the fleeting, horrifying second as we shot forward, my eyes, wide with shock, managed to capture a fragmented snapshot of the figure outside my window. It wasn't a full face. It was a glimpse, a pale, gaunt cheekbone, a shock of dark, matted hair, and a single wild eye, wide and utterly devoid of anything recognizable as human emotion. It wasn't anger or rage I saw there. It was a terrifying blankness, a hollow hunger that froze the blood in my veins. Then, it was gone, whipped away into the darkness by our sudden velocity. Inside the car, the world was reduced to two things: the deafening, panicked sound of our own breathing and the relentless scream of the engine. My father was no longer just driving. He was operating the vehicle with a ferocious, single-minded intensity. His eyes were locked on the road, but they constantly flicked to the rearview mirror, searching for headlights that might be giving chase. I twisted in my seat, pressing my hands against the cold glass of the rear window, my breath fogging a small circle. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing but the empty black road receding behind us. Then, two pinpricks of light appeared, growing rapidly. The other car was accelerating, closing the distance with a predatory speed that sent a fresh jolt of ice through my body. "He's following us," I gasped, my voice a high, thin thing I barely recognized. "I see him," my father said, his voice shockingly calm, but with a steel undertone I had never heard before. It was the voice of a man pushed to the edge, a voice that promised a fight. The road ahead was a twisting, unlit ribbon. My father didn't brake for the curves. He downshifted, using the engine to slow us just enough to keep us on the pavement, the tires protesting with a faint screech. He was driving with a skill and aggression I didn't know he possessed, pushing the old sedan far beyond its comfortable limits. The trees on either side became a dark, continuous wall, a blur rushing past our windows. The headlights behind us grew larger, brighter, filling the interior of our car with a sinister, chasing glow. They were right on our bumper. A new fear, cold and sharp, lanced through me. Would they ram us? Force us off the road into the ditch and the unforgiving trees? My father's jaw was set, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He glanced in the mirror, then at me, his eyes fierce in the dashboard's glow. "Hold on," he commanded. Up ahead, a narrow, unmarked farm road branched off to the right, barely visible. At the last possible second, without hitting the brakes or signaling, he wrenched the steering wheel. The car fishtailed, skidding across the center line before the tires found purchase on the gravel road. He immediately killed the headlights, plunging us into utter blackness. We were blind, hurtling down a pitch-dark tunnel of overhanging trees. He was driving by memory and sheer instinct, one hand on the wheel, the other fumbling for his phone, which he shoved into my hands. "Don't turn on the screen," he hissed. "Just be ready." We listened, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our tires and the frantic thumping of our hearts. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, on the main road behind us, the other car shot past, its engine a fading roar, its twin beams of light sweeping through the trees and vanishing as it continued its chase down the empty highway. They hadn't seen us turn. We were alone again, cloaked in darkness. My father slowly brought the car to a stop, the gravel crunching to silence. The only light came from the dashboard, illuminating our pale, stunned faces. The silence that descended was heavier than any sound, thick with the unspoken horror of what had just happened and the terrifying question of what might still be waiting for us in the dark. The air in the car didn't just grow tense. It crystallized. It became a solid, palpable thing that pressed against my eardrums and made each breath feel shallow and insufficient. The pair of headlights in the rearview mirror was no longer a distant curiosity. It was a predator, and it was closing in. My father's transformation was complete. The relaxed road trip dad was gone, replaced by a version of him I had never seen, a man operating on a frequency of pure, undiluted instinct. His eyes, reflected in the faint green glow of the dashboard, were no longer tired. They were hyper-focused, calculating, constantly performing a rapid, silent calculus between the road ahead and the threat behind. He wasn't just checking his mirrors, he was studying them, analyzing the closing rate of the lights, the distance, the intent. His knuckles were bone-white on the steering wheel, his shoulders hunched forward as if ready to spring. The initial cold knot in my stomach dissolved into a full-blown, icy terror. My own breathing became loud in my ears, a ragged counterpoint to the monotonous hum of the engine. Questions bubbled up in my throat. Asterisk, what is it? Who is that? Asterisk, but they died before they could be voiced. The answer was in the terrifyingly unfamiliar set of his jaw, the absolute concentration that walled him off from me. This was beyond explanation. This was about action. He didn't look at me. His gaze remained locked forward, but his awareness encompassed everything in the car, including my rising panic. When he finally spoke, it wasn't the voice of my father. It was lower, flatter, stripped of all warmth and familiarity. It was a voice meant to be obeyed instantly, without question. It was a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken dangers. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice above the ambient noise of the car. He leaned forward, just slightly, and in a tone so calm it was itself a form of scream, he uttered the 3 words that would forever divide my life into a before and an after. Lock the doors. The command was so simple, so mundane in any other context. But here, in the vibrating silence of that speeding car, surrounded by darkness, it was the most horrifying sentence I had ever heard. It was not a suggestion. It was not a precaution. It was a verdict. It meant the threat was no longer distant or hypothetical. It was immediate, physical, and capable of reaching inside our metal shell. The whisper hung in the air for a fraction of a second, a ghost of a sound that carried the density of lead. In that sliver of time, my mind, fogged with fear, struggled to compute the instruction. Then pure animal adrenaline took over. My hand, trembling violently, shot out from my side. I didn't look for the button. My fingers found it by primal instinct, a small circle of plastic that had suddenly become the most important object in the universe. I slammed my thumb down. The sound that followed was absurdly loud, a solid mechanical thunk that echoed through the car as all 4 door locks engaged in unison. It was the sound of a drawbridge being raised, of a fortress gate slamming shut. It was the sound of safety being desperately, mechanically enforced. And it was the sound that was immediately answered by the violent, metallic crunch of the outside handle on my door being yanked with brutal force. The crunch was not just a sound. It was a physical impact that vibrated through the door panel and into the very bones of my arm, which was pressed against it. The force was savage, inhuman. It wasn't the fumble of someone confused or lost. It was the decisive, powerful action of someone who knew exactly what they wanted to get inside. In the periphery of my vision, blurred by speed and terror, was a hand, pale, almost luminous against the oppressive darkness. The fingers were long, grasping, the tendons strained like cables. The image burned itself onto my retina. Dirty nails, a dark smudge across the knuckles, the violent twist of the wrist applying maximum force. It was there for only a heartbeat, a grotesque apparition attached to the arm of a phantom, yanking, shaking the entire door in its frame with a terrifying intensity. Then it was gone. The simultaneous events, the solid thunk of the lock and the immediate, violent answer from the outside, collapsed time. Cause and effect were not separate. They were a single, horrifying moment of salvation and attack. The lock had held. The door, shuddering from the assault, had remained sealed. But the violation was absolute. The barrier between the safe, warm interior of our car and the hungry darkness outside had been tested, and the sound of that testing would echo in my mind forever. My father's reaction was instantaneous. His foot, already hovering over the accelerator, stomped down. The engine's roar was no longer just sound. It was a raw expression of fury and fear. The car lunged forward like a spooked animal, the sudden G-force throwing me back into the seat and the figure outside into the void of night from which it had emerged. We were hurtling down the black road again, but everything was different. The world outside was no longer just dark. It was now actively malevolent. The trees were hiding places. The shadows were alive. The inside of the car, once a cocoon, now felt like a fragile glass box that had just been struck by a rock. We had been chosen. We had been hunted. And we had barely escaped. The silence inside was now deafening, broken only by the ragged symphony of our breathing and the engine's desperate wail. I stared at the door lock, at the small red indicator that glowed like a single, unwavering eye. It was a tiny beacon of safety that had just proven its worth, a mechanical hero in a moment of primal terror. My hand, still shaking, reached out and touched the cold plastic of the button again, as if to confirm it was real, that it had truly done its job, that we were, for this second, still safe. The ghost of that violent pull seemed to linger on the handle, a chilling reminder that the door was not just a door. It was a boundary that had almost been crossed. The initial, heart-stopping shock of the attack began to recede, leaving in its wake a colder, more penetrating terror. It was no longer a sharp spike of fear, but a deep, icy dread that seeped into the marrow of my bones. The car, our sanctuary, now felt like a trap, a metal box hurtling through a hunting ground. My father's driving was no longer that of a weary traveler. It was tactical, aggressive. He pushed the sedan harder than I thought possible, the engine screaming in protest as we took curves at speeds that made the tires whine and the chassis lean precariously. His eyes were constantly moving, flicking between the road ahead, the rearview mirror, and the side mirrors, scanning the oppressive darkness for any sign of pursuit. I was twisted in my seat, knees on the leather, hands splayed against the cold glass of the rear window, my breath fogging a frantic circle. For a few agonizing seconds, There was nothing but the empty road receding into blackness. The hope that they were gone, that we had lost them, was a tiny, fragile flame in my chest. Then it was extinguished. 2 pinpricks of light appeared in the distance, growing with terrifying speed. They weren't just headlights. They were eyes, predatory, unwavering, and fixed on us. The other car was accelerating, closing the distance with a purpose that was unmistakable. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a chase. "He's still there," I cried out, my voice cracking with a panic that bordered on hysteria. "He's coming faster." "I see him," my father replied, his voice a low, tight growl. The calm was gone, replaced by a grim, focused intensity. The steel in his tone was for me, a forced steadiness to keep my own panic from boiling over. The headlights grew until they filled the entire interior of our car, casting our terrified faces in their harsh, white glare. They were right on our bumper, so close I could no longer see their source, only the blinding light that erased the road ahead and turned the interior into a stark, shadowless panorama of fear. I flinched, expecting at any second the jarring, metal-on-metal impact of them ramming us, sending us spinning off the road into the ditch and the unforgiving trees. My father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle pulsing. He didn't break. Instead, he maintained his speed, his eyes constantly darting to the mirror, his mind working, calculating. He was looking for something, an opportunity, a turnoff, anything. Then I saw it too. Just ahead on the right, almost completely hidden by overgrown brush, was a narrow break in the tree line. A dirt track, likely used for logging or farm equipment. "Hold on!" he barked, the command sharp and immediate. In one fluid, violent motion, he wrenched the steering wheel to the right and simultaneously killed the headlights. The world plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness. The car skidded, the back end fishtailing on the gravel shoulder before the tires bit into the softer dirt of the track. Branches scraped and screeched against the sides of the car like fingernails on a chalkboard as we shot into the narrow tunnel of trees. He didn't slow down. He drove blind, guided by the faint impression of the path against the slightly less black sky between the trees. The sedan jolted and bounced violently over ruts and rocks, the suspension groaning in protest. We listened, our ears straining over the roar of the engine and the crashing of undergrowth. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, from the main road behind us, came the Doppler scream of an engine not slowing down. The blinding light swept past our hiding place, illuminating the tree trunks for a split second in a stark, fleeting flash before vanishing, continuing down the highway at full speed. The sound faded rapidly, swallowed by the night. My father finally eased his foot off the accelerator, letting the car roll to a slow, bumping stop. The engine ticked as it cooled. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the sound of our ragged, panting breaths and the distant, fading cry of the engine that had been hunting us. We were cloaked in a darkness so complete it felt solid. We had escaped, for now, but we were lost, hidden, and surrounded by a silence that felt more like a held breath than peace. The question now wasn't just who they were, but what we would do next, stranded in the black woods with a predator that might soon realize it had lost its prey. The silence in the pitch-black car was heavier than any noise. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from shock, adrenaline, and the deafening absence of the pursuing engine. The only sounds were the frantic, ragged sawing of our own breath and the rapid, metallic tick-tick-tick of the engine cooling down, a sound that seemed absurdly loud in the absolute stillness. My father didn't move. His hands were still locked on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his shoulders rigid. He was staring into the impenetrable blackness ahead, listening with an intensity one could feel. I found I was holding my breath, straining my ears for any sound. The crunch of gravel, the snap of a twig, the returning roar of an engine. But there was nothing, only the faint, lonely sigh of the wind through the pine trees high above us. After what felt like an eternity, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and turned the ignition key back, killing the engine. The dashboard lights died, plunging us into a blackness so complete it felt like being underwater. The sudden silence was absolute. "Dad!" My voice was a tiny, trembling thing, a mouse squeak in the vast, dark void. Are they gone?" "I don't know," he whispered back, his voice hoarse. It was the first time he had admitted to not knowing something. The sound was more frightening than any confident assurance could have been. He fumbled in the darkness, and a moment later, the dim glow of his phone screen illuminated his face from below, casting it in eerie, skeletal shadows. He didn't make a call. He just stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the emergency dial pad. I could see the conflict on his face. Calling for help meant giving away our position. It meant lights, sirens, noise. It was a beacon that could lead help to us, or lead them back to us. The reality of our situation crashed down. We were stranded on an unknown dirt track in the middle of nowhere. The car was our only shelter, and its battery was finite. We had no weapons. We had no idea if they were truly gone or if they were silently circling back, hunting for the turnoff they had missed. My entire body began to shake uncontrollably, a delayed reaction to the terror. The image of that pale hand, the violent crunch of the door handle, played on a loop in my mind. I wrapped my arms around myself, but the cold I felt was internal, a deep chill that no amount of warmth could touch. My father saw me shaking. He reached over, his hand finding mine in the dark. His grip was firm, grounding. "It's okay," he murmured, though the words were a lie and we both knew it. "We're okay for now. We're hidden." He was trying to be strong for me, but in the faint light of the phone, I could see the terror in his own eyes. This was beyond a random act of violence. The deliberate chase, the persistence, it felt personal, targeted. The question hung unspoken in the air between us, more terrifying than the darkness itself. Why us? We sat there in the silent, dark car, two specks of life in an ocean of unknown danger. The world outside was no longer just a place. It was a threat. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the car's settling frame, was a potential footstep. We were prisoners of the night, waiting for the sun to rise, or for the headlights to find us again. The initial flight was over. Now began the agonizing, terrifying vigil. The initial, heart-thumping adrenaline that had fueled our frantic escape began to recede, like a tide pulling back from a shore littered with the wreckage of our sense of safety. In its place, a new sensation flooded in, a profound, bone-deep paralysis. The shaking in my hands wasn't from excitement or cold. It was a full-body tremor of shock, a neurological reaction to a terror too large for my body to contain. I clenched my fists, pressing them against my knees, but the tremors were internal, vibrating in my core. The car was a tomb, sealed in absolute blackness. The only light was the faint, ghostly blue glow from my father's phone screen, which he now held angled away from the windows, casting long, dancing shadows that made familiar shapes inside the car look alien and menacing. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was the sound of listening, of straining to hear a threat that was itself utterly silent. My mind replayed the last 60 seconds on a vicious, hellish loop. The calm whisper, the mechanical thunk, the violent, metallic crunch against the door, the pale, grasping hand, the roar of the engine, the skid into darkness. Each memory was a shard of glass, cutting deeper with each repetition. I kept staring at the door lock, the little red tab that had been our salvation. I found myself pressing my body away from the door, toward the center of the car, as if even the inch of space between me and the window was now a dangerous proximity. My father was a statue beside me. His breathing was still measured, but I could hear the effort in it, the forced control. He was no longer just my dad. He was a soldier scanning a battlefield in the dark, every one of his senses stretched to its breaking point. The fear I felt was pure and selfish, a child's terror. His fear, I realized, was more complex. It was layered with the crushing weight of responsibility. He had gotten us out, but now he was responsible for keeping us alive in this void, with no idea what was out there. The question hung in the air, too terrifying to voice. Were they gone? Or were they out there right now, silent as wolves, circling, their own lights off, Listening for us? Had they seen us turn? Were they already moving down this dirt track on foot? Every rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze sounded like a footstep. Every creak of the car's cooling metal frame was a handle being tried. This was the aftermath. This was the price of escape. Not relief, but a more exquisite and prolonged terror. The frantic run was over. Now we were trapped in the silent, terrifying consequence of it, waiting for the other shoe to drop in the absolute dark, knowing that the world was not a safe place, and that the locks on the doors were the only thing standing between us and the nothingness. The paralysis wasn't from inaction. It was from the understanding that any action, a sound, a light, a wrong move, could be the one that brought the darkness reaching in for us again. Minutes bled into one another, each one an eternity measured in heartbeats and the faint, anxious sound of our own breathing. The initial, paralyzing shock began to morph into something else. A cold, dawning clarity. In the absolute darkness of the car, a silent communication passed between my father and me, a conversation spoken without words, built on shared terror and the grim aftermath of survival. He finally moved, slowly, as if afraid any sudden motion would shatter the fragile silence that protected us. He lowered his phone, plunging us back into pure blackness, conserving its battery. A small, practical decision that spoke volumes about the new reality we inhabited. We were thinking in terms of resources now, in terms of siege. The shared silence was no longer just fearful. It was heavy with a terrible, mutual understanding. This had not been a random act. A random carjacker or a confused stranger doesn't follow you for miles on a deserted road. They don't match your speed, study your patterns, and then launch a perfectly timed, violent assault on a specific door the moment the locks engage. The precision of it was what was so chilling. The whisper and the attack were two parts of a single, horrifying event. I looked toward my father's silhouette, though I could see nothing. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of his realization, a mirror of my own. This was deliberate. We had been targeted. We were chosen. The question was no longer asterisk. What was that? Asterisk, but asterisk, why us? Asterisk. And with that question came a deeper, more personal shift. I saw my father not just as my protector, but as a man who had known, in that split second, exactly what was about to happen. His whisper hadn't been a guess. It had been a recognition. The intensity of his focus, the skill of his driving, it hinted at a knowledge of danger I never knew he possessed. Was this a past he thought he'd left behind? A world of threats he'd hoped to never introduce me to? The man I thought I knew, the dad who grilled in the backyard and complained about taxes, had a hidden layer, and that layer had just saved our lives. There was no need for him to explain. No need for him to say, "That was too close," or asterisk, "They meant to take us." Asterisk, the truth was in the lingering smell of burnt rubber from our tires. It was in the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. It was in the memory of that pale hand, an image now permanently seared into our shared memory. Our relationship had fundamentally changed. We were no longer just father and child on a road trip. We were allies, accomplices, two people bound together by a secret the rest of the world would never believe, forged in the cold furnace of a shared, narrow escape from an unknown evil. The trust between us was now absolute, but it was a trust built on the ruins of our innocence. We had looked into the abyss together, and the abyss had tried to grab me. We would never speak of this night in the same way we spoke of other memories. It would become a silent, sacred, and terrible scar that we alone shared, an understanding that the world was a far darker place than we had ever admitted that morning. The first hint of dawn was not a glorious sunrise that promised renewal. It was a slow, grim leaching of the absolute blackness into a murky, monochrome gloom. The world revealed itself in shades of gray, the trees morphing from terrifying specters into mere trunks and branches, ordinary and yet forever sinister in their familiarity. The sight was not a comfort. It was an exposure. The darkness had been a blanket, however terrifying. The light meant we were visible again, our fragile metal shell naked and vulnerable in the growing light. My father didn't move until the world was fully cast in the pale, weak light of a clouded morning. His hand, when it finally reached for the keys, trembled slightly. The engine's turnover was a violent, grating roar in the profound silence of the woods, making us both flinch as if we'd been shot. He didn't turn on the headlights. He simply put the car in reverse, one arm around the passenger seat headrest, his body twisted, eyes darting between the path behind us and every shadowy gap in the trees, every potential ambush point. We emerged onto the main road like ghosts returning to a world that had continued, oblivious, while ours had ended. The highway was empty in both directions, a stretch of gray asphalt under a gray sky. It was just a road. But it wasn't. It was now a crime scene without a marker, a place where the fabric of reality had torn. Every mile we drove was haunted. Every curve reminded him of the desperate skid onto the dirt track. Every straightaway was where those twin headlights had clung to our bumper with predatory intent. The drive home was a silent 40-mile-long vigil. There was no radio. The comfortable quiet of our journey out was a distant memory, replaced by a heavy, thick silence pulsating with the echoes of what we'd endured. Every car that appeared in the distance was subjected to a ruthless analysis. Its speed, its make, its distance. Our hearts would clutch until it passed, its driver offering a harmless wave or a completely indifferent glance, unaware of the paranoia they had just ignited. Every pedestrian on the shoulder, every parked car, was a potential threat, their innocence now subject to scrutiny. The sound of the door locks automatically engaging at 30 miles per hour would, for the rest of our lives, be the sound of that violent crunch and my father's life-saving whisper. The event didn't end when we pulled into our familiar driveway. That was when it truly began its permanent residence in our lives. It unpacked its bags and settled into the foundations of our home, our routines, our very psyches. The next day, my father went to the hardware store and returned with a new, heavy-duty deadbolt for the front door, its steel sheen a stark contrast to the old, brass one. The installation wasn't a chore. It was a ritual, a silent act of fortification against a threat that had no name and no face. He began a new habit of checking all the window locks before bed, a slow, methodical patrol that I would watch from the top of the stairs. He wasn't just checking. He was reinforcing the walls of our castle. For me, the trauma was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. It was the reason I would jump violently at the sound of a branch tapping against my window pane at night. It was the cold sweat that would break out on the back of my neck whenever I found myself driving on a dark, empty road, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, searching for a pair of headlights that held its distance a little too perfectly. It was the reason I could never again sit in a car without my hand instinctively, compulsively, checking the lock button. The police report was an exercise in futility that only deepened the sense of violation. How do you describe a ghost? Pale hand, a dark-colored sedan, no license plate, no distinct features. The officer's polite skepticism was a secondary injury. Our story sounded like a paranoid fantasy, a shared hallucination. It became a cold case, a file in a drawer. But for us, it was a hot, open wound that never fully healed. The lingering trauma was not just the memory of the fear. It was the catastrophic loss of a fundamental truth we had never known we possessed, the illusion of safety. The world had been permanently divided into before and after. The before world was one where night drives were boring, where darkness was just an absence of light, where door locks were a formality. The after world was a place where darkness could hold a conscious, malevolent intelligence. It was a world where your father could transform in an instant from a familiar comfort into a hardened survivalist, revealing a hidden layer of his soul you never wanted to know existed. My father and I were bound together by it, our relationship forever altered. We were allies in a silent war no one else knew we were fighting. We could be at a family Thanksgiving, surrounded by laughing relatives, and a single, brief look across the table would acknowledge the secret we carried. It was a bond forged in the cold furnace of shared terror, an unwelcome inheritance of hypervigilance that we would both carry for the rest of our days. The road trip had ended, but the journey into a life of heightened perception, of listening for the quietest whisper of danger, had just begun. The locks had held that night, but the trauma had slipped through, and it had made itself at home.